And then the high official who defrauded them also like writes a letter to the banker to tell him to get rid of the documents. Because of course he defrauded the priest of a moon and he was scared of the moon now. It's just, you can just see it like the guy in a panicking mood writing like this note to the banker of like, oh, get rid of the documents. And then the banker didn't, because otherwise we wouldn't have them. And it's just fantastic how you can see like day-to-day panic almost in these documents. So.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionist podcast. This week, we are joined by Dr. Lauren Dogaer. She has an MA in Archaeology and Egyptology from the University of Leuven. She has a PhD in Egyptology from the University of Basel. She is currently a research fellow in Egyptology at the University College Oxford. And her PhD was in the socio-cultural connections between different groups of priests, specifically regarding like burial customs and stuff in ancient Thebes. So welcome to the show. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much.
So when you reached out to me, I thought this was so interesting because I feel like Egyptian burial like practices are one of those things that I feel like everyone thinks they know what they're about. And then when you actually start looking into it, you're like, wow, there's a lot more detail that goes into this than they mummified people and put them in giant pyramids. So I thought it was so interesting to discuss this. So I wanted to know what sort of drew you specifically to looking at these mortuary priests.
Well, it actually already started when I was doing my undergrad in history in one of the more general historical research method courses. Everyone sort of got like ancient sources assigned to them to write a paper about. And the professor, she gave me a couple of papyri about priestesses who worked in the Serapeum temple in Memphis, near Cairo, and in modern-day Saqqara. And it was just such a fascinating topic to work on these Ptolemaic priestesses that I really just got into the topic, and for the listeners to explain. So I'm working on the Ptolemaic period, which is like 332 until 30 BCE, more or less. So after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and these priestesses. When you think about Egyptian priests or Egyptian religion, I think most people think it's very complicated and very, almost philosophical in a way, how these priests must have worked. But of course, there are also a lot of practical aspects related to priestly life. And by working on these priestesses, that's really how I learned about these practical aspects, and it really made me develop an interest in archival research as well. So I'm talking about ancient archives, which is a little bit as opposed to dossiers. Like dossiers are basically a group of texts that is gathered by modern scholars, by papyrologists to work on a certain topic, while ancient archives are basically groups of texts that were gathered in antiquity by a person or a group of people. And you have different types of archives. It's not only the institutional kind, which you might think of, especially when keeping in mind more recent history, but it's also can also be very private. It can also include letters, for example. And sometimes it's also a mix of things. You can have like a notary who kept like more professional documents, but then also mix it with personal documents. And these archives, well, they're usually written in ancient Greek, or in the Ptolemaic period, also in Demotic, which is one of the final language and script phase of ancient Egyptian. So you have hieroglyphs, then you write it very cursive, you get hieratic. And if you then go towards the first millennium, or in the first millennium BCE, and you write it even more cursive, you get demotic. And it's very difficult to read. There are not that many people who are specialized in it because it can be really horrible. And yeah, these are the scripts these papyri are usually written in. And for my priests in Thebes, which is modern day Luxor in the south of the country, they kept their documents together in these archives, and they usually put them in jars in one of the tombs in the necropolis, which is why they were preserved, because they were so safely stored away for 2 millennia, basically, for so many years. And I need to mention that these archives, they were not found in like official excavations, but they were basically looted and sold on the antiquities market in the 1900s. And some of the papyri, they were even like torn in half to like get more money for selling them. And that's why most of the archives that I've been working with, they are basically spread across a lot of different European and American collections. And in order to then sort of reconstruct the ancient archive, you basically have to do like museum archaeology and just really gather all of the different papyri that are spread across these different collections. And then the types of documents that we have, like I said, it's a mix of personal and professional documents. And for the priests, and actually for many people in Ptolemaic Egypt in general, very often you ended up doing the profession of your father. So these mortuary priests, it really was like a family business. So that's also why the archives, they're sort of family archives, but they're also professional because they relate to their job. And as I said, they're bilingual, Greek, Demotic. And what is really interesting is that some of the texts were originally written in Demotic, but were then translated into Greek for lawsuits or for other legal matters. Because whenever they had to go to court, for example, the Greek judges would not be able to read the Demotic texts. So that's why we have like these bilingual archives, and that's why they also have been studied. These Theban priestly archives have been studied already very early on, because this really helped understanding the Demotic. And unfortunately, there had always been there was a lot of focus on the Greek side, just because it was more easy to understand. And even now today, it's always the Greek texts that get edited and published first, because it's just a lot easier to understand. But to actually answer your question, it's really these archives and these papyri, they're giving so many insights into daily life about these priests, so many practical aspects that you might not necessarily think about when you think about like Egyptian religion, that really drew me into the topic.
Yeah, I can imagine now that you're saying that they're like family records as well, that like you would get an insight into like family structures and stuff, or like, you know, things being passed down. And it's more than just like a political, bureaucratical like documentation as well. It's really interesting.
Absolutely. It's documentary material, so that's also why. It's so different from the funerary texts that we have, which were really, written for religious purposes. You have funerary papyri usually written for the deceased in order to keep them safe, in order to help them almost as a passport to eternity, to go into the afterlife and live on in the afterlife. And then as opposed to that, you really have these documentary texts which are so practical. They are literally contracts, like marriage contracts, sale contracts of houses, letters, notes, lists, and that makes it just so interesting to get this practical perspective.
So, can you give us a little introduction or insight into who these priests were and what exactly it was that they were doing?
Yes. So we're talking mortuary priests, so we have to situate ourselves in the necropolis, so in the Theban necropolis in Luxor. And you basically have two main groups, let's say. So you have the embalmers, which were called Tarihyotai in Greek and Cherihebu in ancient or in Egyptian Demotic. And the Cheriheb is literally the one who is under the ritual. And it's very often translated as a lector priest because he was the one who was reciting rituals while they were embalming the body. And the Greek term tarihyotes literally means the one who pickles, as in the one who pickles a human body. And interestingly, the term is also used for people who pickle food or fish. So a fish pickler was also a tarihyotes. So that's where you get a very Greek practical perspective on things, because of course the Greeks didn't have a word for mummification. Like, how do you say this in Greek? So we see it very often with these traditional Egyptian terms that they sort of, they just made a very practical description of what the priest in question was doing if they didn't have like a way of actually translating it. And what is also interesting with all these different kinds of titles, that they are very regional. Because if you go to the necropolis in Memphis, for example, you might come across the same titles of the priests, but they may actually be performing different kinds of functions. So that's always something that you need to keep in mind, is regionality. But yeah, to get back to the priests, so we have the embalmers as one group who are, of course, embalming the deceased, or mummifying them. And from this group, we basically only have one papyrus archive. Most archival material that we have, most of the papyrus archives come from the libation pourers, or choachutai in Greek, or wachmu in Egyptian Demotic. And they were pouring the libations for the deceased on an offering table. It was usually water, sometimes also wine or milk. And they were doing this on a weekly basis. Were likely also reciting rituals while performing these libations. And this was, of course, in order to maintain the cult of the dead of the deceased, because they had to receive water or like libation offerings and food offerings in order to continue living in the afterlife. And as I said, they were doing this on a weekly basis, which means every 10 days, because an Egyptian week was 10 days, and they were also doing it during specific festivals. And what is a little bit puzzling is, of course, they're like pouring these libations for the deceased. But the question really is, like, were they doing this for every mummy, like separately, or are they doing it for every tomb with like different people buried there? Or that's another possibility. During the Ptolemaic period, you have a couple of libation installations that were built in the central part of the Theban necropolis, in the Asasif, which is the core part of the necropolis. And it would also be possible that they were just pouring libations in these central libation installations. But it's very difficult to say. They were clearly very well aware of what they were doing and who they had to pour the libations for, because, of course, the family of the deceased, they were paying for these services. And they actually kept in their archives a meticulous record of who to pour libations for. So we have literally mummy lists, so lists with names and titles of people that they were pouring the libations for. So they knew what they were doing. And so we have the embalmers, we have the libation pourers, or the kowakutai, the kowakites. And these kowakites, in addition to pouring these weekly libations, they also worked as doorkeepers, or pastophoroi, which is, pastophoros is the one who lifts the curtain in like specific areas in the temple. The demotic term is very much debated at the moment by dematists, so I'm not going to go into detail there. And what is of interest with this term pastophoros, so the one who lifts the curtain, for the temple of Deir el-Bahri, which is originally the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. In the Theban necropolis, this temple was reused in the Ptolemaic period for the healer cults of the deified individuals Amenhotep, son of Hapu, and Imhotep. So it basically functioned a little bit like an Asclepieion in the Greek world. And in this sanctuary, there were also pastophoroi who worked there, so lifting the curtain. And they actually found a lintel in the inner sanctuary of the temple that was used during the Ptolemaic period that likely had a curtain attached to it. So it's really interesting that they found this. And to get back to the kowakites, so they're pouring these weekly libations, and at the same time they also functioned as pastophoroi, not in Deir el-Bahri, but in the temple of Medinet Habu, which is a little bit more to the south. And there they really guarded the door during the Decade Festival, so the 10-day festival every 10 days, again, when it's the god, this is a bit complicated, but it's the god Amun of the Luxor temple who travels every 10 days from Luxor to Medinet Habu to pour the libations for the ancestor gods. And of course, in reality, it's actually a high clergy priest of Amun who is pouring the libations, because the god can obviously not do that himself. And it's the kowakites who are guarding in their role as pastophoroi the doors of the sanctuary while this ritual is going on. And afterwards, then the procession with the god Amun continues towards the Karnak temple. And the kowakites then go to the necropolis to also pour the libations, same as the god did, but then for like all the normal deceased in the necropolis. So that's a little bit the functions that these priests performed.
Yeah, it's a lot more functions than I would have thought, actually. And I didn't really think about them having like different roles and stuff. So it is interesting to know, like, you know, all the different things they were doing and the different sort of groupings, I guess, that they were in. Would there have been like a class difference between them, or would they have been seen as like of equal rank? They just do different jobs.
Yeah, that's indeed a very interesting question. I would say that generally speaking, there would have been a difference in religious hierarchy. Let's say that priests who were working in the main Karnak temple would have been, religiously speaking, higher on the ladder than priests working in the necropolis. But on a social level, I would say that they were a lot more equal than is often assumed.
Okay, and how would the general public have viewed these mortuary priests? Were they respected individuals, or?
Yeah. Well, generally they would have definitely been respected, I'd say. I mean, there are not that many sources that attest to it, but traditionally speaking, of course, mortuary priests and especially embalmers, they were very much respected in the sense that they had the knowledge to embalm a body. They had the knowledge of all of these rituals that had to be recited during the embalming, during during the pouring of these libations, which was so important in Egyptian society, to continue on into the afterlife, you needed your body embalmed and you needed the libations and the food offerings. So they had like a sort of sacred knowledge, so to say, and they definitely would have, from a traditional Egyptian point of view, a lot of prestige. But then the Greeks come in, and it tends to be a little bit more complicated, because in a lot of the Greek sources from Ptolemaic Egypt, you can really see the influence from the classical world, where death was really seen as something not pure, not clean. The dead, they were also in ancient Greece and Rome, they were buried outside of the city walls, and people who were like burying were involved in the funerary industry there, they were often not allowed to actually enter the city. And you can also see that in Egypt, where the mortuary priests can sometimes be described as the exopolutai, so the dwellers outside the gate, or allophyloi, which are outsiders, which means that they are sort of perceived as something impure in at least some sources, Greek sources from Egypt. We even have a mortuary priest, not from Thebes, but from the Fayum, so the large depression in the north of the country, where a mortuary priest is described as not being allowed to enter the village because of his profession. So, yeah, in this instance, he likely sort of used it as an excuse because he didn't actually want to enter the village, rather than that it was a rule that was actually enforced. But it does mean that the rule was somehow there. And it's also an idea that we find in Ptolemaic Thebes. And therefore, we have to turn to one of the lawsuits, which is called the Hermias case. And it's a lawsuit between the Greek Hermias and a group of the Coachites. And the minutes of the lawsuit, they were meticulously written down in Greek, and they were kept in one of the archives of the Coachites, which is why we have them. And this is also one of the instances in which the original demotic contracts had to be translated into Greek for the Greek judges. And so the lawsuit, it's about the ownership of a house that is disputed. Hermias is saying that it's his house, while the Coachites are providing documents that state that it is their house. It's a lot of drama. And both of the parties actually have lawyers. And it's the lawyer of the Greek guy Hermias who says or accuses actually the Coachites of storing mummies in the house. And he's telling them like, yeah, but this is not allowed because the house is located so closely to the dromoi leading towards, so the processional roads leading towards the temple, being the temple of Karnak. And so Hermias is kind of using this idea as an argument that they're not allowed to do this. But again, of course, this is a very Greek idea. Like from an Egyptian point of view, not an issue. And in addition to this, the lawyer of Hermias actually calls the Coachites tariheutai, so embalmers. And he even refers to a decree that was issued by the royal doctor, so the doctor of the king, in which the embalmers are forbidden to live on the east bank, so close to the temple. There has been a lot of debate in the literature about this decree. It likely was never actually put into place because we do have embalmers later on attested as still living there. And in addition to this, the lawyer of the Coachites actually counters the argument by saying, yeah, but they're not tariheutai, they're not embalmers, they are libation pourers, and they are allowed to participate in all these festivals when pouring the libations. And he's sort of like glorifying them, and this goes on for quite a while. It's really interesting papyrus. If you're ever in the Museo Egizio in Turin, you can see it. And in the end, it's actually the Koakites who won the lawsuit from this Greek guy, because they actually had like the correct documentation stating that they owned the house, while Hermias apparently didn't have anything. And yeah, this lawsuit is so interesting because you can clearly see the sort of Greek influence pulled in here. Like, oh, you cannot store the mummies so close here. This is not something you do. And oh no, but they're embalmers, they're impure, they're not supposed to be here. But in the end, the Greek judges still decide that the priests win simply because they had the right documentation. So they were still very much respected in that sense. So yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting case study where you can see that there is this Greek impurity. It is somewhere. It did exist, but it never actually was that much enforced in practice, I would say. So all in all, I'd say that the priests were respected.
Yeah, it actually seems like a really interesting case study to show, like, okay, maybe like individuals might have issues with it, but from a governmental, like, legal point of view, they're like, we're not enforcing your prejudice. Like, that's a you thing. They've got the paperwork, so they win. Doesn't matter if they're doing weird mummy practices or like stuff that you're not okay with. Like, legally, it's all fine. Like, everything's grand. So, I've just noticed you mentioned there about that lawsuit, and then you mentioned previously about court documents. So are these mortuary priests involved in court structures a lot? Or are they mentioned in court documents a lot?
Not in like official court documents, but they just somehow ended up in a lot of lawsuits. And of course, I mean, generally speaking, most of the documentation that we have from people is legal, because what are the documents that you store away safely somewhere? It's your marriage contract. It's the contract that you own the house, or any other kind of legal documentation. You may also store a few private letters or a few lists, but generally speaking, the documents you really want to safekeep are legal, a little bit as what we do today, of course. That's also why we have so many tax receipts from Ptolemaic Egypt and Roman Egypt, because, people had to pay their taxes and they had to prove that they paid the taxes.
You can never escape
That's
taxes.
why we have so much legal documentation. No, you can, no, not even then.
So your PhD specifically was on the socio-cultural connections between these different groups of mortuary priests. So what kind of, I guess, can you explain to the audience, like, what were socio-cultural connections? Like, what are they? How do they differ between, or are they similar between these groups?
Yes. So maybe first to explain, so the different groups of priests that were playing a role in my research. So they were the mortuary priests that I already explained. So the embalmers and the Koakites, which we know from all of these archives. But also a lot of other kinds of priests. So also the priests who worked in the smaller temples and sanctuaries on the West Bank. So I already mentioned this Ptolemaic reuse of the Temple of Der al-Bahri. So that was one of the locations. Also a sanctuary that was connected to the cult of the sacred birds in Thebes. So in the north of the necropolis, there was one of a very big catacomb-like tomb where mummified birds were buried, and there was a sanctuary attached to it where, of course, also priests worked. In addition, also in the temple of Der al-Medina, which was specifically dedicated to the goddess Hathor, and then also a few chapels around the necropolis. So, and the priests working in all of these smaller temples and sanctuaries, let's say they are basically known from one archive. which belonged to a priest who worked in the temple of Deir al-Medina. And in that archive, it becomes clear that many of these priests sort of work in the different kinds of locations. So we have the mortuary priests, we have the priests working in the smaller temples and sanctuaries. And then we have another group of people who are not strictly priests, but they do work in the larger temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, which is the Theban temple personnel. And we actually know a little bit about them, not because we have their archives, but because they are mentioned in the archives of the mortuary priests. Because as I mentioned, these mortuary priests, they also kept the sale contracts of the houses that they lived in. And the houses that they lived in were basically located in what was called the House of the Cow, which is a residential area north of the Karnak temple. And in this sale contract, so whenever they sell houses to each other or to other people, not only the house in question is mentioned, but also all of the neighboring houses. And very often, this is why we know or have the titles and names of members of the temple personnel, because they were also living in that residential quarter. And when I say temple personnel, I'm specifically thinking of people who were in charge of preparing the offerings, such as butchers or bakers or beekeepers, or also people who were guarding certain parts of the temple, such as pastophoroi, which I mentioned earlier, or people who were in charge of making the cult equipment, such as carpenters, or also perfumers, making offerings and so on. So that was a little bit the third group. So mortuary priests working in the smaller temples and sanctuaries, the temple personnel. And then, of course, we still have the actual clergy, so to say, who was working in the temples of Karnak, Luxor, Medinet Habu, and also a little bit, a few other locations more to the north and the south. And these priests were basically rotating between the different locations, and they could also serve different kinds of gods. But of course, the most important one was the god Amun. And what is interesting here is that we do not have documentary archives from the clergy working in the larger temple complexes, because the mortuary priests and that one priest from Deir al-Medina, they all stored their archives in the necropolis somewhere, safely in a tomb, which is why they were never found. While the priests from the temples may have stored it either in their house in a more residential or more domestic context, or in the temple, and that would have been flooded away or just destroyed over time, and that's why we don't have any documentary material from them. But what we do have is their funerary tomb equipment. So we have the tombs of these priests with coffins, mummy bandages, stelae, funerary papyri protecting the deceased. And this funerary equipment often mentions the names and the titles of these priests, which is why we do have some information about them, but nothing really documentary, unfortunately. And why did I study these different kinds of priests? Well, as I mentioned, from the first three groups, we basically have all these documentary archival material written in Demotic and Greek. And this has mainly so far been studied by papyrologists or by people, especially for the Greek sources, with a more classical background. While the funerary equipment, often containing names and titles and funerary texts and rituals and so on, it was usually written in hieroglyphic, hieratic, also Demotic, and this is mainly the domain of the Egyptologists. So you do have this arbitrary research divide, which I sort of tried to, bring together in my PhD research, thereby really bridging the two domains, and also the temple and the necropolis, and really study the social-cultural connections between these different kinds of groups.
Yeah, I do. I find it interesting like you're saying like there's the classical kind of group and then the Egyptology group, and they don't always mesh well. You would think Egyptology, like in some spaces, would like fall under classics, but they're like very delineated. I studied classics in my undergrad, and I thought going into it that like it would vaguely include some level of Egyptology, and they were kind of like, yeah, the Ptolemaic period, and I'm like, but there's many more. Why did none of that included in any of this?
Yeah, it's very arbitrary, and it's sometimes really difficult to just get like different kinds of researchers together. But yeah, I keep fighting for it. So let's see.
You're fighting the good fight. So you mentioned when you emailed me, and I've been so interested to learn more about this, but you mentioned that some of the mortuary priests were also selling mummies. So what was that about? Was that normal? Or is that like some black market thing that they're doing underground?
No, that was normal. Well, selling mummies, yes. That's also how it is sort of described in all of the contracts that we have, but they're not actually selling the mummies themselves, but they're selling either the right to pour the libations for a mummy or for a deceased, or the right to mummify a certain deceased beforehand. So it works a little bit like having sort of concessions in the necropolis for the libation pours, or for whom they were allowed to pour the libations, and also concessions on certain villages where people lived, and then had to be mummified when they died. The embalmers had concessions on those villages. So that's a little bit how it works. So it's not that they're like just randomly selling mummies in the back of their house. I mean, that would have been cool, but that's not what happened. And that's is also
a later history thing. That's a Victorian thing.
Yeah, where you get mumia and stuff like that. Yes, but that's not yet what was happening. And this is also the reason why it often ended up in a lot of arguments and a lot of lawsuits, because they did have sort of these agreements and these concessions and these contracts. But of course, sometimes it went wrong. We have one instance where I believe there were like two embalmers, and they had like sort of the villages divided. But then there was like one person, and one of the villages was basically the village near the Karnak temple, or sort of in the Karnak temple, that was in one concession of one priest. But then someone from another village came to the Karnak temple and died there. And then there was like this whole issue of like who is now allowed to mummify this person, and this like became a lawsuit. And because of course, in case it wasn't clear yet, this is just business. You know, it's really a family business.
It's such an interesting thing to like think about, people arguing over who gets to mummify someone.
Yeah, because I mean they were paid for doing this. You know, it's their job. But yeah, it's a bit funny sometimes how they sort of ended up in all of these arguments. And also just like they could sell, they could lease, they could inherit these mummies to one another. And it's actually very interesting, and it sort of plays into the larger research that I was doing, because it really also shows the social cultural connections between also these mortuary priests and the clergy of the larger temples. Because, of course, you have these professional connections between them. As I mentioned earlier, you have this decade festival where the god Amun of Luxor crosses the Nile. And you have the clergy of Amun who are pouring libations for like instead of the gods in this ritual in the temple of Medinet Habu, and then a bit later, like at the same time the Kohakites are sort of guarding the temple. Later on, they also pour the libation. So you really have this professional connections, but you also have it in another way where you can really see that they are sort of using the same terminology for the different kinds of services that they perform, because you have these mortuary priests who can like sell mummies, or like the rights to pour the libations, or the rights to mummify people, which is described in a particular way in the Greek and the Demotic texts. But it's interesting because the priests working in the larger temples, they were working in a kind of rotation system, so they were not always in service. So they were always working for a few months. And they could accumulate performing different functions in different months. And that's why you sometimes get these very elaborate long title strings for these priests. But what is interesting is that they could swap temple months amongst each other. And when they do this, they describe it in the same way as when mortuary priests are sort of swapping the service for the mummies. And also our other group of priests, so the ones working in the smaller temples and sanctuaries, they could not swap temple months, but they were working in liturgical days. So they could accumulate different days of services in all of these little locations that I mentioned. And also there it's described in the same way as when Kohakites are sort of swapping mummies, let's say. So it's really, because it sounds a bit funny when you say they're like selling mummies, but it really situates in a bigger picture, in a bigger religious system that they were part of. Even though they were working in the necropolis, the others were working in temple. They were really part of like a larger religious system, but like using the same terminology for not only the services that they perform, but also the kind of remuneration, the kind of salaries that they received for performing all of these functions. You can also find with the different groups. And in addition to that, there's also more than just the professional connections, because I already mentioned the House of the Cow, this residential area north of Karnak. And there you also see that individuals from all of the different groups could live in adjacent properties. It's only a few examples, and we definitely don't know how the whole area looked, because we only have the archives of the mortuary priests, of course. We don't have archives from other people that would have lived there, but at least for some of the houses, it was definitely the case. And what is also interesting is that when they are selling these houses, or when they are marrying someone, you always needed a few witnesses to come with you to the notary office to sign the contracts. Usually you needed 16 people, which is quite a lot. Yes. And we have examples of the clergy, so the clergy of Amun, of the bigger temples, acting as witnesses for contracts regarding property of the mortuary priests. And also we have one example, the other way around. It's we don't have that many examples because, of course, as I said, we don't have the documentary texts from the clergy themselves. But so they also knew each other definitely on a personal level as well. So to get back to it, they're selling mummies, but there's a lot more going on. Than that, definitely. And they really fit into a larger Theban religious system. And what they are doing, these selling mummies, is really seen, they're using the same terminology as what the other priests were doing. So it's, I don't know if it was at the same level, but it must have really been seen as something very, very similar.
Yeah, it sort of dawns on me that like so much of what you're researching and what you've mentioned and stuff, like can almost be broken down like to like an individual like level. Like you can follow individuals and like see their relationships and like who their neighbors are and like different things like that. So you must be able to get such a, maybe not in-depth look, but you're looking more like you can see individuals in the records, as opposed to, I feel like a lot of the times with, obviously the further back in history you go, you get population level information or, you know, profession level information, but you don't always get like that, like this person did this job and he lived here and he had these neighbors and he was in this lawsuit and like all of that.
Yeah, that's why it makes it interesting, and that's why I really like these archives so much. There's so much material in there. I mean, it's also quite a lot of text. It's a couple of hundred texts, so there is a lot of material that you can study, and you can really study it from different perspectives. That's why I like them so much.
So, was there anything that sort of surprised you, or what surprised you the most maybe when you were studying the mortuary priests?
Well, we actually already touched upon it. I'd say that just how often they end up in lawsuits, it just gets a bit funny. It's like, it's just a remarkable amount of evidence for this. And actually, thanks to all this mortuary priest drama, let's say we really did get a lot of insight, like practical insight into legal matters in Ptolemaic Egypt, because these mummies, they were sort of, even though they were like not selling the physical mummy, but like the right to do things for it, they were in the legal records seen as private property. So thanks to these lawsuits, we really got a lot of more knowledge about how legal disputes worked, which people or which officials had to be contacted, who had to be present during a lawsuit, and so on. And it's really these the day-to-day aspects rather than the more religious and vague aspects or practices that you don't always understand. That's just what really surprised me in a way, because it feels so modern in a way, feels so very close, and that's just not something that you would expect from Egyptian priests, I would say. So I never thought I would get so much like practical knowledge, or I just really could have like made an image in my head of, okay, this priest is like going there and he's doing this, and that's just something that surprised me, I'd say.
In the few case studies you've mentioned, I'm getting like a TV show, like sitcom set in an ancient Egyptian Theban courtroom of like all these mortuary priests.
At some point, I really need to do it. I really need to make like a sitcom or a drama series, because just the priests are it's just wow. It's really interesting. We also have like the papyrus archive of the Royal Bank of Thebes. And there at some point is also, it's the clergy of Amun, which is actually one of the rare instances where the clergy of Amun is featuring in documentary texts. They had to arrange like a festival, and then they needed like new anchors for the religious boat that was used to cross the Nile with the statue of the god on it. And then there was like a very high official who defrauded the priests and stole their money to buy the new anchors. And then it was like of course, the festival had to happen because it was for the god Amun. And just when reading these texts, I can just see the priests in the Karnak temple panicking because the anchors will not be in time for the festival. You can just imagine it. And then the high official who defrauded them also like writes a letter to the banker to tell him to get rid of the documents, because of course he defrauded the priests of Amun and he was scared of Amun now, even though he was a Greek. And it's just, you can just see it like the guy in a panicking mood writing like this note to the banker of like, oh, get rid of the documents, and then the banker didn't, because otherwise we wouldn't have them. And it's just fantastic how you can see like day-to-day panic almost in these documents. So yeah.
So funny. Yeah, it honestly does sound like the script of like some like TV show or something.
No, but it's just because we have this it's documentary, it's daily life, it's that's what makes it so much fun to work with.
So I wanted to ask you, are there any sort of misconceptions about Egyptian funerary practices or these Egyptian mortuary priests that you wish could be like set straight, or like, just those commonly held beliefs that people have about ancient Egyptian funerary practices that aren't true or maybe been blown out of proportion?
Yeah, I would say that it's not something static. I think if people think of Egyptian funerary practices, that they think of this was how they mummified, this is how the funeral went, this is how the offerings were brought, and ta-da. But it does change a lot over the millennia. It also depends from region to region in Egypt. So it is a lot more complicated than I think that the image that most people have in their head. And there is also so much that we still don't know. And when it comes to the Theban mortuary priests specifically, I think I really want to set the record straight that they were not just they're funny guys, they're fun to work with, but they were not just like randomly selling mummies and were like, the pariahs of the society, and were not allowed to live on the East Bank because they were like working with the dead. Because very often they are really seen as like lower clergy, because of this Greek influence that is clearly there and in a way existed. But like I said, many of the Greek side, let's say, has been studied a lot more because there are fewer people working on the motic, and that sort of seeped into like the classical idea has sort of seeped into the modern mind of how to view these priests. And it's just a lot more complicated than that. It's like I said, like I would say that on a religious level, there is definitely a sort of difference, but on a social cultural level, I would say no. So they're not low clergy. That's definitely something I want to set straight.
They are dramatic, but they are not lowly.
Yeah, there is a lot going on, but it's just because we have their documents. Imagine what we would know from the high clergy if we would actually have their documentary texts.
I'm sure they were even more dramatic. I just get that vibe.
I mean, I don't know, but come on, if they already panic for like not getting their anchors, okay, it must have really been a big problem. And like not having the festival of a moon happen. Yeah.
Yeah. It does sound like it would be a big headache.
Yeah.
So you also have your own up and coming podcast called Drunk on History, which will be coming out in February, I believe.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that's the plan.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little more about your podcast? What's it about?
So I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to get back to my mortuary priest because that's actually how it started. So
it's all connected.
It's all connected. There is logic. Somewhere between writing chapter 3 and 4 of my PhD, there was this idea. Inspiration. So there's actually one papyrus, which in one of the archives, which describes the rules of the association of the mortuary priests, because they did not just pour libations for the deceased, but they also gathered together in an association to drink wine in honor of the gods. I mean, they also did a lot of other practical things in this association, of course. But one of the things they did was gathering together to drink wine. And the text specifically mentions that they are allowed to drink a maximum amount of 2 jugs of wine. How big these jugs were, we don't know. Would have been nice to find out. And there is one priest who is actually even in charge to check that no one exceeds this amount. And they even have to pay a fine to one of the temples if they do. And this sort of inspired me to think like, is this an economic measure? Is this a sort of attempt at moderating alcohol usage? And it might actually be that, because also for our clergy in the larger temples, we have a similar source, because we have the Book of the Temple, the text is called. We have a few manuscripts of this text, and it's actually a manual of how an ideal temple in Egypt should look. And there are a couple of versions of this text preserved. And it also mentions that priests who had a drinking problem should be kicked out of the temple service. So there really is this sort of idea of, because if you think of like priests getting drunk, yeah, they might have, but there is sort of still this idea of moderation. And this inspired me to ask a lot of questions, like how did ancients deal with alcohol use and misusage? And did they have like law codes in which they stated rules? Did they have myths warning for excessive drinking behavior, or depictions on drinking cups, maybe warning them? And all of these questions, I would like to answer in my podcast, in which I get drunk on history. And in every episode, I will discuss a different ancient civilization with a different specialist, including Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, ancient India, Mesoamerica, and so on. And the first episode will be recorded very soon. And it will become available on Spotify and Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. So stay tuned, I would say. And people can already subscribe to the website if they want, drunkonhistorypodcast.wordpress.com, or follow me on Instagram, drunkonhistory_podcast, I think. But
perfect. Yeah. I will make sure to link all of those in the description.
It's going to be better than me.
Follow along.
Me saying
easily. It sounds very interesting, though, and I will definitely be down for listening. I already know someone in my office, our archaeobotanist, would be very interested, because anytime we get any archaeobotany remains that have anything to do with alcohol production, she's like, now I gotta look up how they made alcohol in the medieval period.
Yes. Yeah.
Right up her alley.
Yeah.
So
I think it's a very interesting concept. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. It's one of those things that you don't really think about. Like, you know, like we've so many laws and stuff around alcohol now, like, you know, kids can't have it, or like maybe not laws, but like general advice of like, if you're pregnant, don't drink alcohol, don't drive and drink alcohol, like all of these warnings and laws and everything. And you do have to wonder, like, I think it's just generally thought that like, sure, they had no rules about alcohol in the past. It's like, but is that true? Because we know it's bad now. I'm sure they also knew it was bad in excess. They knew. I mean,
they would not have written records about issues and things go wrong with alcohol if they didn't. So I just think it's a very interesting concept to research. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. So I wanted to ask you as well, before we go, about your current research. So at the moment, you've just started in October, I believe, at Oxford, and you're looking at tomb reuse in the Theban necropolis, which is also on theme for the episode as well. So obviously you've only just started, but could you give us maybe a brief introduction into what it is exactly that you're looking at, and maybe what you're hoping to get out of this research?
Yes. So, of course, the Theban necropolis has been reused for a very long time. Very often, like existing rock cut tombs were reused by like adding burial shafts and so on. And this is not something new, but while we have a fairly good idea of um, who was buried in the necropolis during like the New Kingdom and the late periods, we don't have a social profile at all for the Ptolemaic period. And as you know by now, we have all of those mummy lists from the Koachites and all of those sale contracts of tombs with mummies sold between the priests, literally mentioning names and titles of people and who they were buried next to. So based on this material, I would like to make a social papyrological profile. And in addition, I will also look at the epigraphic records, so maybe names and titles mentioned on walls and the tombs or on the funerary equipment, in order to make an archaeological social profile as well of who was buried next to whom, and try and see where those two profiles overlap or are complementary to each other. So literally mapping out the names and the titles of the individuals, and then again analyzing on a social cultural level who was buried next to whom. Maybe a Koachite could be buried to a high clergy priest of Amun, and that would say a lot about their social cultural connections. And spoiler alert, they could.
It all sounds very interesting. So we'll definitely have to have you back on in a few years to talk about that as well, and to talk about the results of your podcasting discussions as well. So before we go, is there anything that we haven't discussed yet that you want to bring up or that you want to mention?
I don't think so. I think we mentioned a lot of aspects. I would say maybe just explaining that all of the things that I talked about was really happening in a multicultural setting, in a multilingual setting, which also makes it very interesting, but also very very complicated, because we have all of these sources, but very often coming from different kinds of perspectives. And that's what makes it actually a lot of fun to look into, and it also makes it very, again, quite modern in a way, to look at a society where people with different ethnic backgrounds, different social cultural backgrounds, where we're all living together.
Yeah, it seems like a real melting pot of different things going on. So it does seem a very interesting period to be looking at as well.
Yeah, that's also, I think, the tomb reuse is so interesting, because also there we will have people from different social strata, different kinds of backgrounds, buried together. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren, for being on. This has been a very interesting conversation, and we clearly will have much to catch up on in a few years as well.
We will.
So thank you so much for being on, and thank you to the listeners for tuning in and joining us. I will see you all in next week's episode. Goodbye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.